Hello and welcome to Gegenpressing, the Bundesliga podcast. This is the preview show. I'm Manuel, he's Stefan Bienkowski. And Stefan, are you footballed out yet?
I'm footballed out, and I feel like I've probably spoke to you more this week on this podcast than I have my own wife. That's how I feel right now, Manu.
Well, just a look behind the scenes here. It is Thursday when we always record our preview show, whether it was the old format or the new format. And that didn't used to be an issue, but we're actually sandwiching this preview show between the Champions League, the third episode of the Champions League recap show. So it's if you're not a subscriber, of course you're not getting the recap shows. So this is the content you're getting for the second time. But if you are a subscriber, this will be the fifth podcast you'll be hearing on us. But it's actually at halftime for us between the first and second part of the fourth podcast. That makes no sense, but whatever. We are here because Champions League provided us with 5 German teams with a new schedule. That means 3 days. It's a lot of football, Stefan. It's hard to keep track of it all, but I guess UEFA is doing everything in their power to give the people what they want.
It is. It's maybe not doing what we want. They obviously didn't consult us when they decided to start showing Champions League games on Thursday nights, which has, as you said, completely made a mess of what we want to do. But we're just about squeezing everything in. It's been a lot of football, though. I'm looking forward to the weekend where I can just sit down, put my feet up, and enjoy it.
No, absolutely. Well, I signed up for a 210 plus kilometer race on Sunday, so bike race. The last one for a while, and last one of the season. See how I get on. It's going to be a challenging one. Hopefully the weather is nice, and hopefully I can just finish. That's the 2 goals for that day. But other than that, yeah, I'm gonna enjoy Friday and Saturday with some more football. And yes, we want to preview this match day. Some interesting games on the schedule. We talked plenty about the Champions League teams. We were going to make a little bit of an exception this week to talk some more about 2 of the Champions League, 2 Champions League teams, as Stuttgart and Dortmund. We're going to preview that match, but we're going to start with the Saturday night game, or the Saturday after evening game, I guess, the Topspiel, Frankfurt against Gladbach, Stefan. That is one that we kind of picked out as something that we want to spend a bit more time on today, because I think we both think it's a really interesting game. And also you did write about Frankfurt striker Omar Mamouche on your newsletter that came out on Tuesday. So it's a really good time to maybe spend some time on Frankfurt, because we haven't yet, and also maybe take another look at Gladbach and where they are at in what is, a really big game between 2 big fan bases in German football, Stefan.
Yeah, it is. It's 2 teams who, maybe it's not fair to say they're both in similar situations. I would certainly say Frankfurt a little further ahead than Gladbach. Frankfurt obviously a kind of mid-table or top 8 side who maybe have aspirations of becoming a top 6 or top 4 team, and Gladbach are a team who are just hoping to avoid relegation and stabilise mid-table this season, I think. But both have had kind of, stop-start beginnings to the season. Frankfurt lost their opening day match day against Borussia Dortmund 2-0, but have kind of since clawed themselves back towards decent form, obviously beating Hoffenheim 3-1 and then last weekend beating Wolfsburg 2-1. And yeah, I did my newsletter on Omar Marmouche at Frankfurt, because he's really kind of stealing a lot of the attention of Frankfurt this season, and they do kind of have this really interesting dynamic team, in the sense, especially attacking players. Obviously, the most obvious one, of course, is Marmouche, who's been the guy who's kind of scoring and creating the goals, but the kind of creative striking duo that he's formed alongside Hugo Ekitike is really quite impressive. Ekitike set him up for the first goal against Wolfsburg. If I'm not mistaken, the 2 of them set each other up for goals against Hoffenheim, or they both combined to set up a goal for, I think it was for Larsen in the Hoffenheim game. And that's not even really considering Igor Matanovic, who's the really impressive young Croatian player who's fortunately had spent most of his time on the bench watching these two guys do their business. But he's waiting in the wings as well to kind of prove himself as well. And it's just quite fascinating because, last season we talked about Dino Topmoller coming in, playing this very defensive football, making sure Frankfurt were this kind of team that didn't make mistakes, didn't concede goals, picked up the points they were supposed to pick up, and, they did fine. But all of a sudden, this explosion of attacking talent has just kind of erupted with Frankfurt, and I've been really impressed with it, particularly Omar Marmoush, because he's a player who, kind of threatened to become this kind of Bundesliga journeyman. It didn't quite work out for him at Stuttgart, didn't work out for him at Wolfsburg. And then, as I said in the newsletter, in typical Frankfurt fashion, they scooped him up from the bottom of the bargain bin and have blown the dust off him, given him a spit shine, and he's suddenly like this player that half the Premier League wants to sign all of a sudden. And he's an interesting player, but I've probably been talking for too long, so I'll let you jump in and let me know what your thoughts on Frankfurt are.
Yeah, I mean, I have a soft spot for Eintracht. I always think that they're one of those teams that really have the potential to become a top side in German football because of the size of the city that they're in, the stadium that they're in, and the commercial wealth in Frankfurt as well, right? With the airport being there and it being the banking capital of Europe and all that sort of stuff. And I do think that they are doing a lot of things right. They were slowly but surely working their way into that direction. They have made a lot of financial decisions that are very smart. They have control over the stadium in terms of how it's now theirs, and they leased it right from the city, but they have full commercial power over it. The fact that they host these NFL games every second season that generate more than 10 million euros a game for the club. That's a really big deal, and I think they're making some really smart squad decisions now too. Hugo Ekitike, I mean, they tried to sign him right away, right, when Kulu Muani left, and that didn't quite work out. They did end up getting him in January instead. And then, of course, some of the other signings that they made this year, Can Ozun is one that I think is very impressive signing. They got him from Nuremberg, right, a young attacking midfielder, a player that a lot of Bundesliga teams wanted. They ended up getting him. You mentioned the young Croatian Igor Matanovic, who comes in from Karlsruhe. He's one to watch for the future as well. But just so many other ones too, like Rasmus Christensen, right, on loan. Nathaniel Brown is another young player who I think is really fascinating, who comes in right from Nuremberg as well. Artur Theate, another defender. They also hang on to Tuta, who has been a really good, stable player for them for quite some time now, right? It's just they make so many smart decisions, and they're doing it now in an environment that for too long the club, I felt, always was driven by too much emotion, right? The Launische Diva from Main was always the nickname for them, like the moody diva from the Main, from the River Main. And I feel like that's no longer the case. They really kind of managed to every year put right pieces together and grow in one way or another. I mean, so much was made of the fact that they didn't play a great season last year, but from a Bundesliga standpoint, it was actually one of their most stable seasons yet, Stefan.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of that comes down to scouting. A number of the players you mentioned there are players who were more or less overlooked by other clubs. And the two forward players who I think will be really crucial in this game, Hugo Ekitike and Omar Marmoush, are both two players that were more or less on like the for sale sign or the bargain bucket or whatever you want to call it, and Frankfurt have done such a good job of that. Mario Götze is maybe another example of that, perhaps. I know else he was doing well in Holland before he returned to Germany, but it's just they're just very good at looking at the transfer market and saying that guy could do a job for us, and we have the infrastructure, we have the coaching, we have the head coach who can offer an environment for these guys to kind of turn their careers around. And time after time after time, they seem to be doing a really good job of it, which is impressive enough because they're obviously in a league which is full of these kind of clubs that pride themselves on finding young players. I'm obviously watching Leipzig play, Atletico Madrid right now, and I'm sure someone in Frankfurt would say that, we could spend X million pounds scouting Croatia or Bulgaria, whatever, but every time we find a young player, he's probably already signed a contract with Leipzig or RB Salzburg or something like that. So it's a really interesting transfer policy that's slightly different from a lot of the clubs in the Bundesliga. And it's let them put together a really impressive squad. But they've also had a really good run with head coaches as well. They do seem to keep finding smart head coaches. Top Bowler obviously didn't have a huge amount of experience at senior level, but they've obviously had a look at him and thought, well, he should be able to do a decent job for us. And it's put them in a position where they go into this game against Gladbach and probably, well, our favourites, but I also think they probably will do probably enough to win the game.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about this Gladbach side, shall we? Because I think they are in a bit of an interesting position as well. Very tricky start for them when you look at their fixtures, right? They started this season obviously with Leverkusen, a game that they lost, but maybe shouldn't have lost. Then they beat Bochum, no surprise there. And then they play Stuttgart at a time when Stuttgart just seemed very pissed about the world and the situation that they were in, and completely took it out on poor Gladbach. Some team news too with Gladbach, right? Jonas Omlin out again with another injury. We had someone in the Substack today open a chat about this actually, and what Gladbach need to do with their goalkeeping future. Unfortunately for them, Jan Olszewski is also out with an injury, right? So the only goalkeepers that they currently have left in their squads are Moritz Nicolas and Tobias Sippel. Although I do think there is a promising young keeper in the academy as well, and who I'm currently missing. I'm going to look it up in a moment. But, that is the team news going in for Gladbach. And so they're in a little bit of a tricky situation because I think they played 2 games really well, didn't play that great against Stuttgart. But, early indications from them, I thought, were Sione is getting more out of the squad than he did last year. And I mean, you also wrote about Tim Kleindienst and what he can add to the team. He scored 2 goals already in his first 3 games. Kevin Stöger with 2 assists has a really good start for Gladbach as well. I just think this is going to be a really fascinating encounter from that standpoint as well, because Gladbach go to Frankfurt really trying to set a few things right.
Yeah, Stoker in particular, actually, his assist for a player's goal against Stuttgart was outstanding. It's a really impressive dribble. He's been a great signing for them. It's hard to actually gauge whether Stuttgart have had a good or a bad start to the season, to be perfectly honest with you, because they go into that opening match day against Leverkusen with everyone in Germany watching. It's the opening game of the week of the Bundesliga season, Friday night game. And everyone expects Leverkusen to really wipe the floor with Gladbach, and it was quite the opposite. Gladbach gave as good as they got. They pulled back from 2 goals down. Probably really unfortunate to, not leave with a point, considering that Leverkusen got a penalty 11 minutes into extra time. And I actually thought it was actually a really good performance from them. They then go play Bochum, beat Bochum 2-0, and again, another solid performance where they beat a team they had to beat. And then they go into this game against Stuttgart, and, they go a goal down to Dennis Undav 21 minutes in. They then pull one back, and, it was definitely a game. At halftime, I watched this game, and at halftime, it certainly felt like Stuttgart were in the ascendancy, but it by no means did it feel like a game in which they were going to run away with it. It was 1-1, and then all of a sudden, Demirovic kind of just scores an impressive brace, and Gladbach just completely implode. But, for about 45, 50 minutes, they were going toe-to-toe with Stuttgart. And actually, the interesting thing is, if you actually look at their XG by the end of the game, their XG was actually higher than Stuttgart's. So, they definitely, not a great performance maybe, but they didn't give a bad impression of themselves. And, I don't think any head coach would really admit to it as much, but I think Gladbach, and if you asked Gerardo Siona those first 3 fixtures, if he had 3 points from them, he probably would have said, Yeah, that's probably what we'd expect. No one really expects Gladbach to go out and beat the likes of Leverkusen or a very impressive Stuttgart team, who definitely had their tails up or felt they had something to prove, shall I say, is a better way of saying, themselves. So I think Frankfurt will be an interesting test because I'd say they're probably not as good as Stuttgart are at this point in the campaign, and not as good as Leverkusen. They're obviously better than Bochum, but I'm just intrigued to see what kind of performance we get from Gladbach, because I think people are probably looking at 1 win, 3 games, and they really kind of crumbled against Stuttgart, and people think it was the same old Gladbach. But there's just something that makes me think this Gladbach team has something else about them. I'm not sure if we'll see it against Frankfurt, because Frankfurt are good and they're pretty formidable at home. But then they've got Union Berlin, they've got Augsburg, Heidenheim, Mainz, as the 4 games after that. And I would expect them, if they're going to kind of make any big kind of leaps this season, it would be those games where we start seeing them pick up points. Because I do think they've got a good squad. I think they've got a very good, starting 11 of good players. If those players start to pick up injuries or things like that, then we might be in trouble. But I don't know. I just, there's something about this Gladbach team that makes me think there's still something about them. And maybe it might not come against Frankfurt. We'll have to wait and see. But we never know. They could cause an upset here. But on the whole, I'm hopeful that if not this game, then the games to come, they'll start kind of putting points on the boards.
Well, it's interesting because we both kind of say if Gladbach win this, that would be an upset, right? It's that I think is a really big takeaway. We both kind of have Frankfurt is the favorite here, don't we? Going into this match, and I think that tells you everything you need to know. But it's also interesting that we're not saying, oh, Frankfurt are going to win this by a lot. I think it's going to be a super intriguing game, and it is one I think that people really should tune into on Saturday afternoon, or Saturday evening, or Saturday morning, wherever you are, right, in the world. It is definitely, of the fixtures that we have on Saturday, the best, and one that we really wanted to point out. And should be a really, really good game. The other game that we kind of wanted to highlight, Stefan, was the Stuttgart Dortmund game. We tried to reserve the space for not the top 4 teams, but I think it's really hard to ignore this fixture because I think it's going to be such an interesting game. Both these teams also in Champions League action with very different results. I think they both played well, but unfortunately Stuttgart lost to Real Madrid. And we broke that game down earlier this week in one of the recap shows, right? But played really well, I think, against Real Madrid, and at times really looked like a team that was on par. And remember too, that goal, that last one, went in very late, literally the final shot of the game, right, by Endrick, that Müller should have stopped. And then Dortmund, who get all 3 points, very dominant on paper win over Bruges. We broke that result down as well in great detail, and now Stuttgart playing Dortmund, going to Stuttgart, going to their farm team, because that's basically where they signed half their squad this year, didn't they?
That's one way of certainly putting it. And yeah, you'd think Sebastian Hoeneß wouldn't so far say he has a point to prove, but you might feel like some sort of revenge might be on the cards. He's certainly hoping so. Considering the way that the Stuttgart have, or maybe not. Maybe Stuttgart sporting director might shake, Vasquez hand and say, thanks for taking all these players off my wage budget. I was able to sign, Demirovic and Indav to better contracts, etc., etc. You never know how these things work out behind closed doors.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's if the Champions League can't be on, I think this would undoubtedly have been the top spiel. It's a huge game. And what I'm most intrigued by in this game is, I guess I'm intrigued to see how both teams approach it, but I'm also looking forward to seeing how Dortmund do against potentially the first real test of the season for them. I guess you could maybe say the opening game against Frankfurt was maybe that, which they obviously passed with relative ease, but it wasn't a great Frankfurt performance. They looked like a team that was still kind of in transition. They then draw 0-0 with Bremen, which wasn't fantastic. They beat Heidenheim, but they made a real mess of it, if I'm being perfectly honest with you. They didn't make it as easy as they probably should have done. And then, as you said, we broke down the Club Brugge game in midweek on our bonus show, and just kind of give a quick synopsis of that. It was once again a performance that, yes, they got the result, but it's a game in which Bruges were maybe a little too close for comfort is maybe the best word to put. And I'm sure Nuri Sahin would have been full of thanks to Jamie Gittins for the way that he came on and really kind of saved Dortmund's bacon for the most part. But it'll be really interesting to see how Dortmund set up in this game, because particularly in that Bruges game, he set up a certain way, waited a certain period of time, and then brought on, some really more attack-minded and more kind of dominant players, and then very quickly Dortmund looked like a new side. All of a sudden Guirassí's on the pitch, all of a sudden Gittins on the pitch, and that kind of attacking line just seems to have an extra dimension to it, which Bruges just could not handle. And I do appreciate that, there's an art to using substitutes, and some players undoubtedly are better used as substitutes rather than starting players, especially young wingers who have this kind of, explosive pace like Gittins. So I'm by no means suggesting that Gittins should be starting or has to start. And I do appreciate that Guirassí maybe wasn't 100% fit for the game. But it was a game in which Dortmund really struggled to kind of dominate. And as we talked about on the show, I'm intrigued to see how they do against a much better team in Stuttgart, because, we just talked about how they were able to kind of really quite confidently dispatch of Gladbach. And against Real Madrid, struggling to think of a German team that's done that well to go toe-to-toe with Real Madrid at the Bernabeu. The last one I can think of that comes to mind is Robert Lewandowski scored for Borussia Dortmund once upon a time, and that was a long time ago. Scored a brace, actually. If I'm not mistaken, that wasn't the Bernabeu. Maybe
Leipzig won there, didn't they?
Did they?
Was that in Leipzig?
Possibly. They do seem to have like a token German team in their group every season. So I'm missing plenty of performances. But
2-1-1 there last year.
Okay. Well,
yeah.
Regardless, the point is that I thought they played really well. And as you said, the result really isn't reflective of what was a very close game in which Stuttgart could have caused a lot of problems. But equally, we'll have to kind of wait and see how Stuttgart do in this game, because it's all well and good getting yourself all excited and riled up when you're playing at the Bernabeu against Real Madrid. That's obviously a game that needs no player needs any encouragement to get excited about. But it's another thing entirely to then return to the league on Sunday and play against a very good Dortmund team and pick up the points that maybe not expected of you, but you definitely have to fight for. So I don't know. I think both these teams go into this game with maybe something to prove, or something that we have to wait and see how they approach it, considering how the start of the season has gone.
Well, interestingly enough, Stuttgart have won the last 3 competitive fixtures against Dortmund last season. All 3 encounters, Stuttgart beat Dortmund in both times in the league and also in the German Cup, 2-1, 2-0, 0-1. I think what I find really fascinating about this game is how each side is going to respond from midweek. And I think Dortmund have a lot more experience in that, don't they? Because they went so very deep last year and hopefully have learned a little bit from it and took away what to do when you have these midweek fixtures, when you go deep in the Champions League and have to still perform in the Bundesliga, right? And as so many times they didn't in the Bundesliga then, and that's obviously why they finished 5th. But we made a really big point about how Dortmund's squad is so very deep this year. And they have so many players that they can just bring on. Şahin brought on his win against Bruges from the bench. Serhou Guirassy, Giddens, right, Nemcha, Waldemar Anton comes on as well, and he didn't even use Maximilian Bayer in this game. He sat the full 90 minutes. So there's a lot of depth on the bench, and I look at Stuttgart that maybe are not quite there yet. They added a lot of players, right? Mind you, Fabian Rieder came on against Gladbach and was really impressive, right? But also at the same time, we haven't seen Demirovic and Undav together very often yet. We didn't see them together in the Champions League. Of course, he comes off the bench. But you still sense that there is much more squad depth at Dortmund. That's something that they really addressed in the summertime, and I think did a really good job addressing as well. And Stuttgart, because they were robbed the best players by other teams, including Dortmund, they're not quite there yet. I think they will be there eventually because I think they made some really smart decisions. But I think this is going to be a real test for Stuttgart in terms of how deep that squad is, and I think we'll get to find out whether the squad is deep enough to really compete midweek and weekend.
Yeah, we will. And, we kind of talked about this actually after the Real Madrid game, and I did point out that what I'm hoping it's not going to be something like we often see in the Bundesliga where, a team puts in this heroic performance against Bayern Munich, and we often say that the next game or 2 or 3, they just look exhausted or look completely devoid of any kind of intention to win things because physically and mentally they put so much into that performance. But, there are kind of players that Stuttgart can fall back on. Demirovic obviously didn't start against Real Madrid. I thought Leveling was fantastic. Undav continues to just kind of look like a player who's more than happy to just kind of crack on with where he was last season. You also mentioned Vida as well. So, they do have players, maybe not as many as they would like. But it's still early in the season. I would be too worried about fatigue or anything like that. And maybe not. Well, certainly not physical fatigue. Certainly maybe mental fatigue. But equally, they could go into this game feeling that they actually do need to have something to prove. Maybe they'll go into this game pissed off that they didn't beat Real Madrid, and they'll feel like they want to set the record straight against Dortmund because. They were so close against Madrid. The only thing I would say is, and one player I'll be keeping an eye on is Mittelstadt, who I thought obviously he was up against one of the best wingers in the world in Rodrigo, but he had such a poor game in that match, and we know how good he can be. So I'm hoping to see him bounce back in particular. Same with Alex Nubel actually, who should not have let that third goal in from Endrick. It was more or less right at him, and he got a hand to it, so he really should have been doing better there.
Both hands.
Was it both? Sorry, both, yeah. Equally, Angelo Stiller as well, actually, I thought was a little clumsy in midfield. Again, up against world-class players, and one very tenacious player in Valverde. Very few players in the world is kind of, can really hassle opponents quite like him. But, so I think that game against Real Madrid was probably a real education for a lot of these players, but I'm hoping they kind of take what was maybe an injustice in not taking something from that game and take it into this Dortmund match and show what they're capable of rather than, just looking exhausted because they put everything into it.
Yeah, I wonder if Franz Ketzig is going to rotate into this team for Mittelstadt. Some fresh legs, right? And I think that's an interesting one to watch. He didn't come off the bench at all. And I agree with you. I mean, Mittelstadt also seems to have lost his position to David Raum in the national team, right? So maybe I think a sign to come for things to come. But yeah, I think the other thing is to keep an eye on is how pissed off are Stuttgart that Dortmund stole all their best players. That's a question mark I think that we have as well. On this match, and you mentioned it. Yeah, maybe it doesn't really matter that much to them in terms of that allowed us to bring in guys like Emmet Demirovic, etc. But yeah, I think it's going to be a fascinating game, equally to the Gladbach game on Saturday, a game that everyone should tune into on Sunday. I will have to watch this delayed, Stefan, because it's right during my 200k race. When I get home, when I finish this 7 to 8 hour race, I will go put my legs in an ice bucket and watch it back.
Yeah, and that might put Stuttgart's complaints about tiredness and heavy legs to shame, really, compared to what you've gone through on Sunday.
Yeah, it's a crazy one. All right, so that's the two matches that we really want to pay some attention to this weekend. And the other topic that we wanted to look at is Freiburg. They were a really big story this week. Unfortunate injury to Manuel. The really young attacking, really highly talented attacking midfielder, 22-year-old, right? Had a good start to the season, and unfortunately suffered a ankle injury that we learned today is this is good news and bad news. He doesn't need a surgery he can be treated conservatively. If Freiburg, and I thought this was a really good gesture, Stefan immediately renewed his contract. I mean, they've been in talks for some time anyways, but I guess to just kind of set a sign here that they still believe in him despite the injury and all that sort of stuff, that they signed him to a new contract right away. It's the typical Freiburg way, isn't it? But yeah, interesting start to the season. 6 points out of 3 games. Julian Schuster's doing a pretty decent job filling boots that are probably impossible to fill.
Well, yeah, exactly. And it's an interesting kind of comparison to Heidenheim, who obviously have their own kind of long-standing head coach. And, Frank Schmidt has had to contend with a lot of Christian Streich comparisons over the years, but particularly this season. And it's kind of fascinating that obviously they're in the midst of, having their long-term head coach and how well he's doing there. In fact, I think, if I'm not mistaken, this game will be a mark of his 17th year at the club, actually, which is really quite incredible in the modern era. So you've got that aspect on one side, but then obviously the other team have got this brand new head coach. And I think Schuster's done a really good job, to be honest with you. I think we all kind of feared the worst for Freiburg going into this new season, but they started the season with an impressive 3-1 win over Stuttgart. They weren't really up to much against Bayern, but then they came from behind against Bochum to win 2-1. And I'm just intrigued to see how well they do. I was actually looking up some of their stats this week to see how they do compared to last season. And, on the whole, I would say they're probably an improvement across the board. Their attacking stats are more impressive. The defensive stats are more impressive. They're winning more of their physical duels. They're pressing higher, scoring more goals. Not counter-attacking or making as many passes as they did last year, but that's okay. And you would expect, obviously, because Freiburg weren't, classic Freiburg under Christian Streich last season. That's obviously one of the reasons he chose to move on, simply because I think he realised that a malaise had kind of set in at the club under his control or leadership, whatever you want to call it. And I think he probably kind of decided to kind of follow the sword because he realised that, well, maybe the biggest kind of shake this club needs is someone like me to move on. And that's just the way that Streich has always been. He's always been a very kind of, considerate person. And yeah, I think Freiburg have just looked really quite impressive. I've actually been really impressed with Junior Adamu, who I thought was outstanding against Bochum. He got 2 goals. Just looks like a really exciting kind of forward who seems more than happy to kind of create chances and score goals. And yeah, they're just kind of full of a lot of exciting players. It's obviously a shame that Rule will pick up that injury, but if it's any kind of consolation to Freiburg, they do seem like a team who are just really well drilled and more than happy to kind of work under this new head coach. And for the most part, it does seem to be working, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it helps that that Julian Schuster was at the club before, right? As a player, and obviously then just to go through his page, he was the coordinator of talent management. That was his first role in 2018. He signed originally from VfB Stuttgart in 2008. So, he's known the club for quite some time. I think he was the captain at Freiburg too before he retired from playing football. Is from the region as well. Bienkowski is in the outskirts of Stuttgart, so from Baden-Württemberg. So, he understands the mentality and all that sort of stuff. that comes with being in the Schwarzwald. And yeah, it's a really easy transition. I do think the Junior Adamu thing is interesting though, because he was a player who did struggle a little bit under Streich, right? And it's interesting that a new head coach comes in who obviously believes in the same kind of philosophy and the history of the club and all that sort of stuff, but it still is enough of a shake-up that a player who was maybe didn't quite work out as well as he should have works out now, right? So you can have two people with very similar beliefs, but there's enough of a difference maybe to just give enough of a shake-up. So you conserve what Freiburg is about, right? But at the same time, you provide a lot of players with the fresh start that they maybe needed, is I think what I'm trying to say here. And so you still have that continuity, you have that what Freiburg always stood for, that longevity of managers and the fact that this is a very much family-oriented club, and I think that is all provided for, and I think that was a really smart appointment that they managed to do it that way. So yeah, I think Freiburg looked really good, and I'm really curious to see how some of the players that I know come in. I think Aaron Dengshi, he played with the amateur side midweek. He could play a bigger role in this game. He came off the bench right against Bochum, but there's some talk that he maybe starts, and I mean, he is an exciting player. We all know what he's done for Heidenheim. It'd be, of course, hilarious if he starts against Heidenheim, right? His former club. And by the way, I checked that you're right, it's 17 years. Frank Schmidt was appointed head coach on September 17th, 2007, and has been in charge of 627 games, averaging 1.61 points a match. But on top of that, he actually signed as a player in Heidenheim before Heidenheim was Erster FC Heidenheim 1846. It was known as Heidenheimer Sportbund, and he signed for the club in 2003. So there you go. He's been there for, ever. It's a really remarkable thing.
Not many head coaches can lay claim to being at their club before they change the name of it.
Yeah.
Just another thing on, just one more thing, maybe on Freiburg before we do finish up, and it's just on, we talked about that kind of partnership that, Frankfurt have managed to put together, and with Marmoush and Ekitike, and, obviously we mentioned the injury to Rule, which will be really big, but I think if there's also something else that Freiburg fans should be really confident about, it's this really impressive kind of partnership between Adamu and Vincenzo Grifo, and both of them have been obviously fantastic in terms of getting on the creating chances, but actually creating goals. Both of them have been outstanding. I think they've both now got 2 assists to the name. They're both in the top 20 in the Bundesliga for expected assists as well. And they're kind of forming this really formidable kind of attacking three alongside Doan, which will just be something obviously to keep an eye on, because Grifo's all, and it kind of goes back to what you're saying about Schuster obviously mixing the old with the new, because Vincenzo Grifo is basically he is Mr. Freiburg in a sense, almost to extent, isn't he? So
he was briefly gone, right, and came back. Just checking his page. Yeah, he was at Freiburg, and then went to Gladbach and Hoffenheim and decided no, that wasn't it.
Exactly. So it's just an interesting thing to keep an eye on right now, because obviously they're one of the most beloved clubs in the Bundesliga under what Christian Streich did there, but it's a fascinating story that how does a club move on from such a huge head coach, and for the most part I'd say Freiburg and Schuster in particular has done an outstanding job.
Yeah, and I mean, it was one of the stories I think that we also highlighted going into the season. Matt and I did a big podcast last year when Christian Streich decided to step down, right? And they basically right away paved the road for Julian Schuster to come in and say, well, this is yours. This is, the succession planning was immediate, which I think was very smart. And we pointed that out at the time, and it was also one of those stories that we pointed out going into the season, that I think it's going to be really fascinating to see how Freiburg are going to get on. And it's this match day is interesting because it's Freiburg playing against Freiburg 2.0, or the new Freiburg with Heidenheim. So yeah, another really cool storyline to kind of keep an eye on as we transition from Champions League football to back to Bundesliga football. And yeah, just wanted to also point out, let us know what you think about this new format. Any storylines that you are looking out for ahead of this match day, or is there something that maybe you want us to highlight next week before we go into what will be then match day 5, right? So yeah, really curious to hear from you, the listeners. You can always comment in the Substack. If you're not a subscriber yet, then that's the way to do it. As always, Stefan, this show is brought to you by Bet Online. And yeah, any final thoughts before we wrap this up?
No, just looking forward to the usual match day chat in the Substack app with our subscribers. So if you're looking for somewhere to kind of chat to Bundesliga fans and have a laugh, definitely have a look in there. Looking forward to a few familiar faces returning. I think people are a little jaded from the Champions League, are not quite sure what's going on. So the Champions League chat hasn't been as busy, but the match day chat in the Bundesliga is always a lot of fun.
Yeah, the UCL chat was really quiet. I think it's too many games. And I mean, I have to add to a lot of our people or subscribers who chat in the chat are from the US. So it's a lot of games midday in September when it's still nice out, Stefan. So
I mean, I say that it's the Leipzig game is not quite finished yet. There's already still 450 comments in it, so it's not nothing, obviously. But the Bundesliga one's usually twice though, I think.
Yeah. And if you want to recap the Leipzig game, we chatted about that as well. In fact, we chatted about that after this podcast was wrapped up. So on that note, let's end this. Enjoy the rest of the Leipzig game. And yeah, talk to you guys next week. Until then, auf Wiedersehen.